I'm Yvonne Hamoud, registered social worker and owner of New Moon Counseling, but out of the office, I'm a mom, wife, daughter, sister, and friend. Join me each week as I sit with a special guest to discuss everyday things that impact our mental health. We'll be chatting about everything from mental health and relationships to media and current events, as well as personal experiences and reflections, all in the hopes of normalizing our humanness and helping you see that you're not alone. This is Outside the Therapy Room. Welcome to Outside the Therapy Room, everyone. Today we are joined by Chris. Hello, Chris.
Hello.
It's your first time here. Welcome.
Thank you.
Tell us a little bit about yourself.
So I'm Chris. I am a therapist at New Moon Counseling, and I've been here since about April. I work with a lot of teens, but also people from the general population.
And as we always like to ask here, because we're showing up kind of outside the therapy room, tell us a little bit about you outside of work.
Yeah, so outside of work, I am from beautiful Leamington, Ontario. It's a smaller community, lots of farming and such. So I grew up in a more rural community, and I moved to Waterloo for the first time when I was 18. Outside of therapy, I love to do sports, play soccer. I'm also in a band, love music, and I like spending time with my partner, doing puzzles, reading, that kind of stuff.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
You're in a band? That's so cool.
Yeah, I'm in a band. If it's okay, I would plug them.
Yes, plug them.
It's called Smack Jive. It's a funk band. We play locally. We also have some stuff out on Spotify, so if you feel inclined, please do check it out.
Oh my gosh, we'll add it in the show notes. That's so cool. Okay, our topic today is, do you want to introduce it?
Sure. So we're talking a little bit about male friendships today.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
We had an episode before on female friendships with Alex, and in that we did talk a little bit about how different it can be. Obviously, me and Alex being females, we only know our experience from it, but just from observation and in the media, what we've heard both in and outside the therapy room, we kind of talked a little bit about how different it is between female friendships and then male to male friendships. And I think before we started recording, we were talking a little bit about how different it can be for some individuals. I know I have people in my personal life and also experience with some clients who are male and are really longing for more of a deeper connection with other males in their lives, and that can sometimes be challenging.
Absolutely. I think that there can be really different types of friendships and having different levels of depth. And for example, somebody might be looking for a really deep connection with males, and that can be possible. And at the same time, I think a lot of males also value having a bond and more casual friendships through shared activities, for example. Mm-hmm. So I think it's interesting to take a look at what is your goal for friendships, and why is that depth really important to you, and who can you maybe achieve that with, or who can you talk about that with, kind of deepen that.
Yeah. If you don't mind me asking, what's been your relationship like with friends?
So I grew up in a really small town in Germany before I moved to Leamington, and it was interesting because that's a very mixed group in terms of gender, because a lot of those kids were all cousins. So right. It's male and female, and I would say actually that's still one of my closest friend groups. I actually just hosted two of them. They came up to see me, and a few of them are making the plans to come up next summer. So I grew up with a really balanced sense of maybe gender norms or gender stereotypes in friendships. And while there are sort of those distilled friendships, so for example, individual friendships between me and the individual males in that group, there was also that community sense that was cultivated, and women kind of helped, or girls at that time kind of helped shape that. And I think that really kind of helped me as I grew older and I had that blueprint of what a healthy friendship does look like. I have seen a lot of male friends who, for example, have struggled with that, or who maybe open up to me specifically that they have difficulty reaching that level of depth with their friends, because I think a lot of the time males focus on shared activities, but also focus on a shared sense of humor, and within that humor there can be a lot of walls, a lot of putting up barriers to maybe achieving that depth or that vulnerability that they do crave though, right? And that they do really prioritize, but then they end up kind of living that out in romantic exploits, but struggle with that and then experience a lot of heartbreak and have difficulty showing up in that relationship because they're not maybe practicing it with a friend or a really safe male relationship.
Yeah, you touched on something there where it's the vulnerability piece. I think, I was mentioning there are some men who enjoy sports and that kind of environment and that connection over shared experiences and shared activities. There's already kind of a culture that kind of happens around sports.
Yeah.
And when someone, like if there's a male that doesn't really fit within that culture of sports or activities like that, it can, I don't know.
It's fascinating because I will play soccer with guys and I've maybe seen them around for years, and right now I cannot tell you their names. But I've played soccer with them a bunch of times. I think that they're great guys in that context, but I don't necessarily feel the need to deepen that relationship, right? So I think, again, it comes back to, are your needs being met in terms of having that deep relationship? I think sometimes for someone on the outside who maybe isn't experiencing that, it looks like there's that really deep connection, but it might not actually be the case. So even if you do swim in a lot of circles, it doesn't necessarily mean that every single one of those relationships is really deep. And I think that's something that I know some women maybe have a difficult time understanding. Like, I'll talk to my partner about that and she'll be flabbergasted. She's like, what do you mean you don't know his name? I'm like, well, we play together, we both show up at the same time, we have a great time, and then we go home, right? Why does it kind of need to go beyond that, right? Yeah. So I think there's a little bit more, and we talk about this too in sort of thinking styles. Men have that more compartmentalized thinking. Yeah. And I think that maybe applies a little bit to relationships as well. So I think it's very intentional as to when do I want to access that vulnerability, or when does that come out, right?
And like finding the safety and security of being vulnerable, because if you're put in an environment where it doesn't really feel safe, there are more, humor or other kind of connections that you're having, it might not feel like a safe space for certain people to feel like to be vulnerable. Yeah. Before we started recording, we were also talking about like TV shows, and we were talking about Scrubs. We both love Scrubs, and JD and Turk had a really interesting friendship at that time, right? I don't think we saw many male friendships at that time, and I don't remember what it was like. What, early 2000s that show ran?
Yeah, early 2000s, sort of. I think into 2011 or 12. I think that's when they tried to have a comeback season that kind of
wasn't so great.
It belly flopped a little bit.
Yes, yeah. But like in that relationship, JD's very vulnerable. I think there's jokes in that. I haven't seen it in like a couple years, but I think there are some jokes within there of him having more of like a feminine emotion or...
Absolutely, right? He totally lives his love for Turk. Right. And he's very performative in that sense. But he also knows that he's going to get that validation from Turk, right? Yeah. Turk really shows him that it's okay for him to do that, right? JD, that's his personality. He tries to do that in other relationships as well, right? With Dr. Cox, for example. Yes, yeah. But he constantly gets called all these different girl names. Yes. Right? And he's totally invalidated. And it's interesting because I think if he didn't have Turk, maybe he wouldn't try that again. But he sort of knows, hey, I can achieve this, so I'm going to keep working on this with Dr. Cox. And you can tell that they sort of reluctantly built this relationship together.
And it's also like the security of having Turk gives him that confidence to be able to kind of be himself in other relationships with men. Yeah.
I guess what people might find difficult is that they don't show how Turk and JD got there in the first place. True. Right? What was day one like for them, and what did it take for them to maybe overcome some of those barriers at building vulnerability?
Yeah, and a lot of other media that we see, like for example, The Hangover, it doesn't really get very vulnerable until they are in a state like they're drinking, or there's like something that has removed some of those filters that allows them to be more honest.
Yeah, and that opens up a whole other door of maybe difficulty in male relationships, right? And the fact that I have to be in a certain state before I can tell somebody that I care about them. I think a lot of time there is sort of this. You see this in reality TV and in other TV shows and stuff, and it's sort of this performative, like being like, oh, man, like I love you, I'll be there for you, like for everything and all this kind of stuff. But it doesn't necessarily go deeper than that. It's almost like there's these pre-written lines that these guys will use, but it's hard to tell whether there's kind of substance to it, right? And they're sort of learning the language that gets used, but they're not really sure how to apply it on a personal level, more so taking those pre-written lines and just kind of throwing them out there, thinking that this is something that, maybe I have to do, or maybe I have to say.
What is your view of bro culture?
Well, so I think bro culture, it's it's interesting because I think it depends on the context that you look at it in, right? I think if we look at the origin of it with fraternities, with the bro code, if I may say, right? There's a lot of issues with that, right? And a lot of it is sort of targeted at women, right? Sort of the bros before, right? That kind of stuff. Sort of always like covering for each other if there's a lie and stuff. So I think it starts out in these really difficult and these really kind of toxic ways. But again, there's maybe what's underneath that maybe some of the bros have difficulty speaking to is that desire at a brotherhood or a desire at somebody who's going to show up for you unconditionally, who's maybe going to cover for you, right? Or who's going to prioritize you over their partner. I think there's underneath that, there's a really deep desire to be recognized and to be seen within the struggles that you have in life, right? That it's, even though I'm going to do all this stuff or I'm going to, mess up, right? I want there to be this bro culture of having a code and having something to return to, having that stability.
I'm sorry I'm putting you on the spot, like speaking on behalf of all men. I know you're not. This is obviously your own experience and your own view and comfort with friendships, but I do feel like there is some fear, and like you said, sometimes what I have seen with the men in my life and what I have seen again like in TV shows and in the media is very much this, like you said, performative. Like you're putting on this act like yay sports, or oh look at that girl, and all of these comments that are being said, and you spoke to maybe that person actually wanting something more than that, but not really being sure how to like spark that deeper connection.
Yeah. And it's interesting because I think a lot of male friend groups can sort of devolve into just like quoting one-liners at each other and just sitting around and just like quoting movies and doing bits and riffing and stuff. And that's a really comfortable spot, right? And I think a lot of men just really love being comfortable, but then they really struggle when you kind of go that one beyond. I know that in my own friend groups, I've done that before. I said, okay, well, maybe let's get a little bit real, right? And maybe a topic comes up and I go that one next step further and I bring in an emotion, right? Or I say, well, a lot of men struggle with this, right? And you should see the discomfort that even close friends of mine face when I bring this up. And a lot of the time it goes to defensiveness, it goes to a sense of humor, right? Where to the point where I visited with some friends over the weekend and I had made a comment like that last year and he brought it up within the first 20 minutes. Right? And I'm thinking, wow, how much has that been on your mind for the last year? That the moment you see me, right? We don't see each other a lot. Well, the moment you see me, you bring that back up, right? I wonder if I really struck a chord with you there. And then saying, I wish that you would feel comfortable with me to kind of do this, right? Because I know you, I know that you're a really sensitive guy. What's it going to take for you to open up here and maybe use me as a resource in our friendship, right? Because it's okay it's actually okay to be there for each other and to kind of support each other in that way, right? But I think again, then there's a lot of the time it's like, no, I can't do that in a male friendship. I have to be in a relationship with that. I have to be with a romantic partner. And that's why I think we see so many guys just get depressed when they're single because they don't feel like they can access that vulnerability. It has to be a woman for some reason, right? And again, like, this is a generalization that we're talking about in a cis heteronormative setting, right? Like, I'm speaking from my own point of view as someone who, is straight and cis and who has a lot of straight and cis friends, right? Yeah.
Yeah. But we see that all the time, like the, oh no, emotions. Like, I don't really want to talk about that. Even just like telling a friend that you love them. I think like for girls, that can be easy. We can be like, hey, I love you, girl. Like it can just be a very natural thing that we say, but I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like for men, it can be a little bit more challenging to get into that depth of connection, vulnerability. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting because I think it really, maybe there's a cultural aspect to it, for example. Like, for example, I would not really tell, like in Germany, friends don't tell each other that they love each other anyway. That's something that you say to your partner, right? Okay. So from a cultural perspective, I think I've always had maybe a different take on the I love you. It doesn't hold as much weight for me in a friendship.
As you were saying that, I was thinking again about shows because I love shows, but in like New Girl between Nick and Schmidt, like there is like, I'm remembering an episode where he's like, I love you, man. He's like, I love you. But then they get like too vulnerable that then they just start saying like beer, boobs, and like trying to bring it back to like, I don't know, a more comfort level because they had gone in a little bit too vulnerable in that moment.
Oh, that show is so full of stuff. Like Got You Cookie got me cookie, get you cookie.
Yes, yes.
Oh, no.
I got you cookie. Yeah.
And he's so confused. Because he's like, I'm trying to reciprocate, but I
Yeah.
don't know how to put it into words. And he literally falls apart. Like his
does.
language does not, he's not able to do it. Or
But
then
it's both Winston and Schmidt in that relationship that are more like in tune with their emotions and not as afraid of communicating that, whereas Nick is more like a little bit more boxed up.
yeah, and it's really interesting because Schmidt is this weird mix between totally in the bro culture, especially in like season 1, right, where he has all these toxic friends and all this kind of stuff, but also being weirdly open, like as sort of an opposite, right? Like he's really open about how much he cares for Nick and all this kind of stuff. Yeah, there's also that episode where they say we're gonna have guys night, and then they just like build
Talk
a
about
fort
love.
and like listen to Foreigner. I want to know what love is,
Yes,
right?
because Nick was like, I don't think I've ever felt love before, and then
Yeah.
they had to have that little connection moment.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting because not to go too into the therapy room, but I have clients who say that to me too. It's like, you know, I feel like I've never felt love before, and that's such a difficult thing to sit with, right? And to say like, well, if I don't have a frame of reference, how do I know when I get there, right?
Yeah.
In a friendship, let alone in a relationship, and yeah.
And I think like with media too, I keep bringing it back to media, but that's my only kind of source to see, because I am not obviously the one that's experiencing this, but I think we see a lot, like I'm thinking like High School Musical, the jock and the more artistic guy, and like those changes of friends, or how like locker room conversations are, and then how that person's actually feeling, and that need to perform and to, you know, participate in that locker room conversation when in reality they might not really like that. And even just getting into close connections. Like I have, you know, a lot of guys in my life, my brothers and my partner, and 2 boys that are starting to like build those connections. But with those 3 adult men in my life, it has been very different to view their relationships with men. I have one who has a very big social network, is able to connect, and is part of a lot of different social groups. And as you've pointed out with your own experience, some of them are more social, like we go and do this event together and that's the only time we see each other. And other friendships are more long-term, like from elementary school, that they are able to get really deep and vulnerable, and they're able to call each other out and check in on one another and do all of that. But then on the other hand, you know, there's another one experiencing not being into like athletics or into that kind of like being more sensitive, easier for them to connect with women. And feeling like it's really, really hard and scary to connect with a male because they feel like they're more sensitive and they're going to be met with somebody who's not as sensitive as them. And then I have, again, in another situation, there is somebody who has a lot of friends, but they rarely talk. And it's only about like calling someone up to talk about golf. And they have a conversation about golf, hang up. They're like, oh, it was so great to hear about that guy. And I'm like, you guys didn't talk. You guys talked about your golf round. You didn't actually like have a conversation. You don't know what they're doing in their lives, where their lives are at, where they're working right now, like how they're feeling. So it is kind of interesting to see those different, for me at least, to see those different kind of relationships in my own life.
Yeah, I wonder if it comes down sort of to a question of authenticity, right? And to say, well, you know what, like maybe others aren't going to be able to relate to that, but do I feel like I'm getting everything that I need out of my friendships, right? Am I being authentic when I talk about golf for an hour, or is it really about all the things that I'm not talking about, right? And I feel like if you can look at your friendship and say, no, I am being authentic in my male friendships, and I'm getting everything out of them that I could be getting out of them, then I think that's great, right? But I think it's those people who are answering that with no, right? Maybe like one of the people that you talked about who's maybe feeling a little bit more sensitive, right? I wonder if they're needing to be met in different ways, right? And then I think we're sort of coming back to that vulnerability, but then we kind of circle away from it and come back to it, right?
Yeah.
At a certain point, do you need to take a leap of faith, right? Like, do you need to, pick one of the guys that you are more comfortable with and just kind of talk about it, right? How much is it not only about your friend's vulnerability, but also about your own vulnerability, right? I think a lot of men will say, well, I feel like I can't build deep friendships. I can't build these deep relationships, right? And I don't want to call anybody out, right? But also, how much are you trying, right? Or are you used to to kind of having women recognize that in you and then seek you out. And then you're saying, people should be coming to me, right? Because maybe you do kind of have these caregiver relationships where people have come to you and said, like, hey, this seems to be all the stuff that you're going through, right? And it's okay to want that, right? And at the same time, if you're feeling unfulfilled in your friendships, what do you feel like you could do differently to kind of make that happen? No, it doesn't need to be sports, right? But there's lots of guys who have tons of other interests, right? And I think especially as that's getting more normalized, like I would say very few of my friends are only interested in sports, right? There's music, there's board games, there's a resurgence of Magic the Gathering somehow, right? All that stuff, right? There's tons of different types of interests. I think for a lot of men, that shared activity is just kind of a starting point, right? Especially as you're building a friendship. Right. And for example, like I made a new friend over the summer and I had invited him to this event that we were going to go to together. And he came over to my place beforehand and I had this recognition. I'm like, oh, I guess this is the part where I need to actually get to know him and stuff, right? Because I was so focused on like, let's go to this event together and stuff. And I was like, oh, I'm kind of missing out on that opportunity to build that shared connection for us to enjoy that maybe event together a little bit more authentically, right? To actually be able to kind of go in there and say, I'm not going with some random guy. I'm going with this guy who I know this and this stuff about, right? But I think sometimes for men that needs to be really intentional, that step. It needs to be really on purpose that we do that, because otherwise we'll just default to not getting the guy's name, not talking to him about his work, and just kind of doing the thing and living in our own little world.
I think with that too, though, there's a lot of fear of rejection. Like,
totally.
If I'm vulnerable first, how is it going to be received by that person? Especially if they're the ones that are having to take that leap of faith, right?
100%.
Yeah.
Absolutely, right? But I like to say this to my clients, like, the world is full of people waiting for somebody to call. Right? It can't be that you're all telling me that you're always the first to make the move, because if everybody is always the first to make a move, then everybody would be talking to each other. Right? So I think there's this shared perception that like, hey, you know what? I'm always reaching out. Nobody's reaching out to me. Right? Okay, well then put yourself in that person's shoes, because they're probably waiting for you to reach out too, right? And they feel just as vulnerable as you, right? So talk about it. Put a name on that, right? And yes, it's scary, right? And it doesn't just mean pick some guy and be vulnerable with him, right? Because you might not be putting yourself in a great position, right? But if you've known somebody for a long time, they've always been good to you, they've always, had a nice word for you, maybe that is a good person to go with, right? And it doesn't mean that you dive in and you go 100% and share everything that you ever went through as a kid, right? But it could be a starting point to say, you know what, like I'm noticing that we don't have the deepest conversations, right? Or why don't you tell me a little bit about your work, and just kind of ask some personal follow-up questions, right? And build that over time. It doesn't happen overnight, right? It's something that you do have to build over time.
Yeah, no, that's good to remember, because I think sometimes we are looking for that instant connection and instant relationship, and sometimes we need to have a little bit more patience.
Totally. Yeah. Well, I think, when you've been waiting for that for a really long time, or when that's been a goal for a really long time, it's like, okay, well, I'm ready to have this yesterday, right? So let's dive in, right? I think it's like if you've been single for a while, right? And then you're so excited to meet somebody and talk to them, right? And you're saying, okay, well, I don't want to dive in, right? I don't want to scare them off, right? It's the same thing with friendship. Yeah. Just
like a slow build. And I think that's also a way that you're honoring your own boundaries too, right? You don't want to like spill everything out on the table and then kind of be left like vulnerable with all your things out. You want to kind of slowly warm up and ease into it. What are some, you already shared some suggestions on what to do when you have people in your life that you are feeling some form of connection with, like how you can deepen that relationship and that connection. But what would be a suggestion for you when someone is looking for or looking to start making and building male friendships when maybe they don't have those connections close to them? Yeah, sort of starting from scratch. Yeah. It's a really tough spot to be in, I think, especially maybe once you're out of high school or university and you're not constantly surrounded, right? I think high school, university sort of, or college, or they kind of offer that breeding ground for social relationships because you're constantly surrounded by a revolving door of new people, right? And we talked about them female friendships too. I bet you did. Yeah. Yeah, and once you're kind of out of that ecosystem, it can be really tough because you've never had to go out of your way to make friends before. Yeah. So I think it is, and I've said this like a couple times before, but I think it is really about shared interests, shared activities that you can use as a starting point. Right? And then deepen it from there, right? Whether it's sports or whether it's board games or whether it's watching a show or
anything, right? Going to anime club or whatever, right?
Yeah.
Find something that you feel passionate about. I guarantee you there's other people who feel passionate about it, right? Go on a subreddit, like Town of Kitchener, right? City of Kitchener has a subreddit, right? And I'm in that subreddit sometimes. Like sometimes I'll see what people are posting, right? And they're saying, oh, you know, I'm looking for this, or I'm kind of wanting to get this going, or a community of that, right? And just show up, right? See how it feels for you, and see if you can meet somebody who's like-minded there, right? I think it's really tough to go into it with the expectation that this is going to be easy, that this is going to be something that will maybe come naturally. But I think if you have that longing for that deep connection, then you know ultimately it'll be worth it to go through a little bit of that discomfort.
Yeah. I think it's also expectations, because I think, and something me and Alex talked about in the female friendship episode, was sometimes we have these high expectations of having these like very, very close knit group of friends. And that's an expectation because we either see it around us with other people in our lives, or we're seeing it in the media or wherever. And so I'm hearing kind of like the similar thing for male friendships, of just having that realistic expectation. Are you going to have such a close knit group of friends like the guys on New Girl? Well, maybe not right away, but it is something that you can eventually build towards. Yeah.
And the other thing is, do you really want to, live with a bunch of, 32-year-olds in a, one bathroom apartment? The answer is probably no.
While you were speaking actually too about like making connections and trying to find those similar interests, I thought of the movie I Love You, Man.
Oh, yeah.
Have you seen that with Paul Rudd?
Slapping the bass. Yeah.
Yes, I love that movie. But it's so funny because in that, he's very much a girlfriend guy, right? I think they talked about that with the family, where he is in a relationship and he's very much involved in that relationship and is close to the friendships of the partner that he's with. And I think it was around their wedding, trying to plan who the best man was going to be. She had a whole group of girls that were going to be in her wedding party, and he didn't have anyone. And so he goes on these mandates and tries to build those connections with men in that similar way, right? And that's when Jason Segel's character comes in, and they build that connection at the open house, and it's funny and it's awkward, and he's trying to like be cool with him and doing all of the really funny like one-liners, like to say goodbye and stuff, which is a very funny movie. But it is, again, like he's being vulnerable in some way, but there's also challenges of expectations that they have with each other, where he very much wants to kind of, do things on Sundays with his partner, but this new friend is kind of challenging that idea. And I think that was difficult for their relationship, but also for this new friendship dynamic.
Totally, right? Based on what Paul Rudd's character is like, kind of going into that, right? He's already shown himself that he's capable of vulnerability, right? Because he has this great connection with his partner and his partner's friends, right? So to say, okay, well, if clearly I can achieve this, right? If I can have a good relationship either with my girlfriend or my girlfriend's friends, or, an aunt or a cousin or something, right? I have what it takes to kind of build that relationship, right? It's not that this person is just so good at friendships that they're doing it for the both of us, right? So what's actually in the way this here, right? Is it about how I'm expecting to be treated by other men, right? What are my experiences in male friendships? Have I experienced rejection in middle school, high school, whatever? Right? And kind of recognizing that you are maybe not in that space anymore, and that there are actually lots of men who are also wanting to kind of experience that, right?
Yeah, great movie.
Yeah, it's hilarious.
So funny. But is there anything else that you think would be helpful or beneficial for men to know when they're trying to build friendships, deepen either the connections with the guys in their lives that they have now, or as they're starting from scratch and trying to build some of those connections?
Yeah, I'm trying to think, because this is a hard question.
I know.
Right, it is tough, because I think the advice part really speaks to the male language of like, how, what tool do I use to fix this problem, right? And like, that's secretly, I think maybe that's what a lot of men want, right? Where it's like, WikiHow with pictures kind of thing. There's a 3-step process. This is how you do it, right? But the thing is that it is going to involve uncertainty, and it is going to involve maybe an uncomfortable moment, right? And I've seen guys that I know and love like squirm in their seats when they're asked to say something about themselves or something vulnerable, right? It's really tough if you don't practice it, right? It's really hard. And if you if you don't gather that positive evidence that it's going to be received well, then all you have is the story that anxiety is telling you about how it's not going to be received well. So if you don't prove that wrong, that's going to become your truth. So I think really just recognizing that it's a tough process for everybody, right? And that if you are really wanting to get there, it's maybe not about problem solving. It's maybe not about having all the right tools or saying all the right words, but really just being authentic, right? Because that's what you're wanting to get anyway, right? If you're wanting to get a deep friendship, a deep relationship with another guy, then the goal is to be able to be yourself and to be real, right? So the idea, you don't stop being yourself so that you can come back to it, right? You start by being yourself and then try and pick up on, hey, who resonates with this, right? Or who's actually cool with me being myself, and then I'm gonna keep pursuing that, right? If you are finding that you're starting to be yourself and the guys in your life aren't vibing with that, or they're rejecting that, then that's a really tough loss to face. But it might be time to start surrounding yourself with the kind of guys that are going to honor that and value that.
And I think it's important too, and we talked about this in our previous episode with Alex, is not every friend is going to meet every need. Like you have friends in soccer that the need is, hey, let's play a game of soccer. The need is to play soccer. Yeah, totally. And then that's it. And then you have other friends who you're able to connect a little bit more. Like that is going to happen.
Yeah.
And if those friends in your life aren't comfortable with that vulnerability, then they can still serve a purpose in your friendship. It just may not be the group of guys that you're going to have a deep conversation about.
100%. Yeah. It's about acceptance as well, right? Of saying, okay, well, you know what, like I've tried and maybe I've hit a limit with these friends, right? That means they're the kind of guys I'm going to spend Saturday morning golfing with, right? But if I want that additional or that deeper relationship, maybe kind of sacrificing that once in a while, right, as well, right? And saying, okay, I'm going to commit my time and energy to the friendships that I really want to deepen. And if I'm just feeling a round of golf on a Saturday morning, you can still go out and do that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it's good sometimes to have, different people that you're going to connect with on a different basis. You brought up performing, and another way of, seeing that is masking. And sometimes we mask out of like protection because maybe we're wanting to show up a certain way so that we can be accepted and we can fit in and we can do all of that, but it might not fully connect with what we're wanting under the mask. Yeah, absolutely. And I think sometimes that mask actually serves a way to connect with somebody that you used to be, or the kind of person that you were when you first kind of made that friendship. I think if we can like sort of complete the trifecta of sitcoms, we can look at How I Met Your Mother. There's that episode where Ted's friend from high school comes to town, and he like completely devolves into this like immature high schooler, and they're like goofing, they're punching each other and stuff, right? That's not who Ted is, right? But he's kind of putting on that mask just to honor that friendship and to just kind of go back maybe into that space of connecting with a guy that he used to be in a friendship that he used to have, and in a way that's fine, right? Like, no, that's maybe not who he is, but it's if it kind of honors that friendship and it helps him connect with this guy, then there's really not a big issue with that, right? I think the issue with masking can come up when we're maybe hiding our emotions, right? And I think for some men it's really difficult once you've kind of made this decision, or you've taken these steps to kind of grow and mature as a person and to engage that emotional language and to do that self-reflection, and your friends haven't, and you recognize that, and there's sort of this feeling of loss, and then you maybe return to that basic language or that non-emotional language, and you're recognizing, like, this is actually not who I am masking right now, right? And that can be really, really painful, and that's a mask that, like maybe you wear sometimes, but at the same time, like, you don't want to have to wear that all the time, because then you're going to become that person again. Right. I think sometimes we mask in it emotionally, like you said, but then there's like a discomfort with, we do not have the same values. Like, I do not have the same view of women as this guy is talking about. Like, I don't see things this way. And it can kind of be like uh-oh, what did I just get myself into?
Yeah. Do I smile and nod at that joke that you just made? Kind of thing.
Yeah, or do I speak up and say something? And there's like that fear in that too, but it's like, that masking served a purpose in that moment to kind of feel that sense of connection.
Yeah.
And when there was enough, safety or whatever, someone else makes a comment, and then that may be like oh no, not the same values, not actually the people I thought they were.
Yeah, and I think there's maybe a little bit of a responsibility on men to call each other out when they recognize that that's being done to another man, right? I think guys have lots of these sort of one-liners to really discredit when another man maybe brings something up, right? Like there's this sentence that guys use and they say, "It's not that deep, bro." Right? Like somebody brings up something emotional, they're like, "Oh, it's not that deep, bro," right? Like when you hear a friend say that, right? Maybe call him out, right? Maybe say, "Okay, you know what? I think what Buddy's trying to do here is he's trying to talk about something that's really important to him, right? Maybe it is that deep to him, right?" And just kind of call each other out as well, and not maybe stand for that, right? And kind of challenge those patterns, because that might be a reactive response from that person. They might not even recognize that they're invalidating that person in the moment because they think it's funny, right? Or that's just something that they've always perpetuated in themselves, right? Like this narrative of it's not that deep, and if it's not that deep, then I don't maybe have to feel bad for hurting this guy's feelings, right? Or dismissing something that actually is really important to him.
Yeah, I mean, I think when we look at it, we're always like defense mechanisms are popping up, and we're all feeling a certain way. We're all showing up with our own things, but sometimes the way we're presenting is going to be out of protection. So being the tough guy who's maybe really hiding that more sensitive part because of fear of not being seen or being made fun of or whatever.
Well, I think uncovering those emotions and taking off those masks means embracing the fact that there's a spectrum of emotions that includes guilt and shame and fear and sadness, right? But when we look at a sociological sort of lens of how we raise our boys and girls, right? They're not really permitted to feel fear and sadness a lot of the time, right? It's really validated when boys feel angry, right? It means that they're tough, and it means that they've got a lot of energy and all that kind of stuff, right? And that's really reinforced that, young boys and men feel anger. But when they feel fear and sadness, that's something that's usually equated with being a girl, right? Like you're being a girl, or maybe they might use another word. That's not exactly flattering. And there's really that learned response of, well, when this shows up, I'm not really supposed to feel that. So what can I feel instead, right? And by buying into that narrative of anger for a really long time, right, that starts to become your reality. Like, I really do believe that language is how we construct our reality. So if we tell ourselves these stories about our emotions all the time, right, that starts to become how we really think and how we really feel and what we believe. But I think the awesome thing is that we get to choose whether we want those things to be true or whether we want to embrace another reality and do the work to unmask that, right? But we carry the responsibility for ourselves to challenge that, but also for the men in our lives to challenge that when we see it being done in other people. And it doesn't mean going heavy-handed and being like, bro, you're being whatever, right? No, but it means kind of calling it out assertively but gently, right? And saying like, hey, you know what, that's not cool. Like, I think this guy's making a great point, or this is something that's clearly important to him. Let's listen to what he has to say, kind of thing.
Yeah, and if that doesn't feel comfortable doing it in a big group setting, like taking that person aside afterwards.
Absolutely. Yeah, you don't have to do it in front of everybody.
Yeah.
Because that's one way that that dude's going to probably feel a lot of guilt and shame and, never open his mouth kind of again, or now feel like he kind of has to double down, or that he doesn't get to be vulnerable, right? But just doing it in a kind of gentle way.
Yeah.
100%.
When you talked about boys and the difference of how boys and girls are being raised, like, oof, that's tough for me. With boys, like trying to raise them to, accept their emotion and trying to be cautious of what people are saying to them when they are feeling fear and sadness. But yeah, I think our overall message is it's okay for you to be vulnerable in a moment where it feels safe, appropriate for you to do that, and also being patient, putting yourself out there. So being vulnerable and at the same time taking those chances.
I read somewhere recently that men actually experience emotions more frequently and more intensely, but also shut them down harder and push them away more. And I think that's a really interesting kind of observation, like when they actually do study that men actually have these needs to express their emotions all the more, right? And shut them down all the more, right? And I think if we kind of take a look at an accountability piece again here, when we push away emotions, when we don't listen to what they have to say, they're going to come out in ways that we don't have control over. And then we are actually, causing harm to the people that, in our sort of macho masculinity, we're saying, we're here to protect and all this kind of stuff, right? And all these narratives about men having to be strong and all this kind of stuff, you end up actually serving a different purpose. And you end up actually doing a lot of damage. You can really hurt some people by not being in touch with your own emotions, right? So maybe that's just kind of, again, a PSA to men that, these macho stories that you tell yourself about being above emotions or being stronger than that are actually, they're doing a lot of harm, not only in your life, but also in the life of the people that you say are so important to you.
Back to where you started of like men having relationships or being more vulnerable with women in their lives. It's like, okay, women are sensitive. And so they're going to be more accepting of these emotions and finding it harder to do that with men. But I think, again, overall, it's just checking in on our emotions and trying to find, those opportunities, those people that may already be in our lives that we feel comfortable enough with to be vulnerable and start engaging in those deeper conversations. Are there any last thoughts you want to share with peeps?
I think that ultimately, everybody's deserving of the type of friendships that they want to have. And I think that wanting those deeper friendships, those more lasting friendships, requires that much more work and commitment, right? So if you're missing that and you're maybe grieving that takes a lot of work and that it doesn't come naturally, right? I think you're on the right path to understanding the value that friendships have and that appreciating that work that you get to then kind of reap the benefits of, right? Like you're sowing the seeds for a plentiful harvest in that sense by kind of going through this process right now of self-discovery and maybe desire and recognizing for yourself that is really something that you want to prioritize and that you want to put that work, commitment, and vulnerability into.
Yeah, and patience. It's going to take some time.
Absolutely, and patience, yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Chris, for joining us. We are going to include your band in our show notes, so everyone check out Chris's band. And while you're at it, follow us at Outside the Therapy Room on TikTok and Instagram. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right. Bye. See you next time.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to Outside the Therapy Room. This podcast is intended for educational and entertainment purposes only. If you reside in Ontario and are interested in working with one of our therapists, please visit our website in the show notes. If you reside outside of Ontario, a quick Google search or search through Psychology Today will help you find a therapist near you.